Yeah, okay. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, дуже шановні пані та панове. Okay, I'm going to speak English. I'm going to speak English because this is a subject on which I want to make sure I speak very precisely. There was a famous interview, speaking of Hannah Arendt, where Hannah Arendt was asked, was bleibt? And she said, es bleibt die Muttersprache. And in a certain way, I've had that feeling these last 6 months. I've never spoken so much English in my life as in the last 6 months, because so many of the themes of Hannah Arendt and so many of the things that I think I've learned about history from Russians, from Ukrainians, from Poles, and others, so many of these lessons, so many of these themes are now relevant to my homeland, to the United States of America. So when we ask why historical responsibility or why German historical responsibility, I want to begin from that point of view. I want to begin from a universal point of view. I'm not coming to you as an American saying, we've understood our past and therefore everything is going well in our country, right? On the contrary, I think it's very important for all of us, whether things are going well or things are going badly, whether we're Americans or Germans or Russians, to be humble about our various weaknesses in dealing with our past. And above all, to be realistic, to be sensitive, to be concerned about how our failures to deal with our own national past can have surprisingly great and immediate and painful consequences for the present and for the future. So when we ask, as the ambassador did, quite rightly, why should we be discussing historical responsibility just now? Why, when Russia has invaded and occupied part of Ukraine? Why, when Brexit negotiations have just begun? Why, when a whole series of elections between populists and others is being carried out across Europe? Why, when the constitutional system of the United States of America is under threat from within? Why, in this moment, should we talk about historical responsibility? My answer is that it is precisely for those reasons that one must talk about historical responsibility. There are many causes of the problems within the European Union, and there are many causes of the crisis of democracy and the rule of law in the United States. But one of them is precisely the inability to deal with certain aspects of history. So as I say, I'm not coming to you from the position that Americans have figured this out. On the contrary, let me begin talking about Germany by talking about the United States. Why do we have the government that we have now? In some significant measure, it is because we Americans have failed to take historical responsibility for certain important parts of our own history. How can we have a president of the United States in 2017 who is irresponsible on racial issues? How can we have an attorney general in 2017 who is a white supremacist? Because we have failed to deal with important questions of our own past. Not just the history of the Second World War. It might not come clear from this distance how radically the current presidential administration is revising the American attitude towards the Second World War. But when our foreign policy is labeled America First, we are referring to an isolationist and very often white supremacist movement which was meant to keep America from entering the war against fascism. When we commemorate the Holocaust without mentioning the Holocaust involved Jews, when a presidential spokesman says that Hitler only killed his own people, right? We are in a very different mental and moral world than we were just a few months ago. But it's not just that. We also have a presidential administration where the president wonders aloud why we fought the Civil War, right? Why it was, after all, that there had to be a conflict in America about slavery. Now, I'm not just mentioning this because, as Marieluise Beck alluded to, I take every opportunity now to involve myself in the domestic politics of my own country, but rather because this question of slavery, precisely, this question of what a colony is like, of what an empire is like, leads us directly to the blind spot, what I take to be the blind spot, in German historical memory. As you will all know, the American frontier empire was built largely by slave labor. As we don't always remember, it was precisely that model of frontier colonialism, of a frontier empire built by slave labor, that was admired by Adolf Hitler. When Adolf Hitler spoke about the United States, it was generally, before the war at least, with admiration. And it was a question for Hitler: who will the racial inferiors be? Who will the slaves be in the German Eastern Empire? And the answer that he gave, both in Mein Kampf and in the second book, and in practice in the invasion of 1941, the answer was the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were to be at the center of a project of colonization and enslavement. The Ukrainians were to be treated as Afrikaner, or as Neger. The word was very often used, as those of you who read German documents from the war will know. By analogy with the United States, the idea was to create a slavery-driven, exterminatory, colonial regime in Eastern Europe, where the center was going to be Ukraine. Now, you have been told many times what results from this. So let me just briefly summarize. The point of the Second World War, from Hitler's point of view, the purpose of the Second World War, from Hitler's point of view, was the conquest of Ukraine. It is therefore senseless to remember any part of the Second World War without beginning from Ukraine. Any commemoration of the Second World War that involves the Nazi purposes, the ideological, economic, and political purposes of the Nazi regime, must begin precisely from Ukraine. Now, this is not only a matter of theory, this is a matter of practice. German policies, the policies that we remember, all of them focused precisely on Ukraine. The Hunger Plan, with its notion that tens of millions, zig Millionen, people were going to starve in the winter of 1941. Generalplan Ost, with its idea that millions more people would be forcibly transported or killed in the 5, 10, or 15 years to follow. But also the final solution, Hitler's idea of the elimination of Jews. All of these policies hung together in theory and practice with the idea of an invasion of the Soviet Union, the major goal of which would be the conquest of Ukraine. The result of this ideology, the result of this, I thought Germans were taller than this. I'm stooping all the time. It's not my bad posture, it's the microphone. I want you to hear me. The result of all of this, the result of this ideology and of this war, was that some 3.5 million inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine, 3.5 million inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine, civilians, were victims of German killing policies between 1941 and 1945. In addition to that 3.5 million, about 3 million Ukrainians, inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine, died as soldiers in the Red Army or died indirectly as a consequence of the war. Now, these numbers are numbers for inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine alone. Of course, the numbers are greater when one includes the entire Soviet Union. But it's worth being specific here about the difference between Ukraine and the rest of the Soviet Union, for two reasons. The first is Ukraine was the major war aim. Ukraine was the center of Hitler's ideological colonialism. But beyond that, in practice, all of Soviet Ukraine was occupied for most of the war, which is why for Ukrainians today, war is something that happens here as opposed to elsewhere. Hitler never planned to conquer any more than 10% of Soviet Russia. And in practice, German armies never occupied more than 5% of Soviet Russia, and that for a relatively brief period of time. Now, Russians suffered in the Second World War in a way that is unthinkable to West Europeans, in a way that is unthinkable even for Germans. But nevertheless, when we think about the Soviet Union, the place of the Soviet Ukraine is very special, even by comparison to Soviet Russia. In absolute numbers, more inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine die in the Second World War than inhabitants of Soviet Russia. In absolute terms. And these are the calculations of Russian historians. In absolute terms, which means in relative terms, in proportional terms, Ukraine was far, far, far more at risk than Soviet Russia during the war. In other words, it is very important, as Marieluise Beck precisely and correctly formulated it, to think of the German Vernichtungskrieg against the Soviet Union. But at the center of that Vernichtungskrieg, precisely, is Soviet Ukraine. So if we want to talk about German responsibility for Russia, very good. But that discussion must begin with Ukraine. Ukraine is on the way to Russia, and the greatest malicious intention and the greatest destructive practice of the German war was precisely in Ukraine. If one is going to be serious about German responsibility for the East, the word Ukraine must be in the first sentence. Now, this also goes for the longest and the most earnest, and I think the most important discussion having to do with German responsibility in the East, and that is German responsibility for the mass murder of the Jews of Europe. That is another discussion which makes no sense without mention of Ukraine. As I was walking to this Parliament building, I passed on the street the famous picture of Willy Brandt before the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Willy Brandt kneeling famously before the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is an important turning point in the history of German self-recognition, of German responsibility. But I ask you to think back not to Willy Brandt in Warsaw in 1970, but think of Jürgen Stroop in Warsaw in 1943. Jürgen Stroop, the German police commander who put down the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, who issued the orders for his men to go with flamethrowers from basement to basement to murder the Jews of Warsaw who were still alive. When Jürgen Stroop was asked, "Why did you do this? Why did you kill the Jews who were still alive in the Warsaw Ghetto?" His answer was, "Die ukrainische Kornkämme, Milch und Honig von der Ukraine." Even in 1943, Jürgen Stroop was thinking, as he's killing Jews in Warsaw, of Ukraine. He's thinking of the German colonial war in Ukraine. The Holocaust is integrally and organically connected to the Vernichtungskrieg, to the war in 1941. It is organically and integrally connected to the attempt to conquer Ukraine. This is true in three ways. The first is Ukraine is the cause of the war. Had Hitler not had the colonial idea to fight a war in Eastern Europe to control Ukraine, had there not been that plan, there could not have been a Holocaust, because it is that plan that brings German power into Eastern Europe where the Jews live. Secondly, the actual war in Ukraine brings the Wehrmacht, brings the SS, brings the German police to the places where Jews could be killed, which is the third point, the methods. It became clear to Germans in 1941 that something like a Holocaust could be perpetrated because of massacres in places like Kamyanets-Podilsky, or more notoriously Babi Yar on the edge of Kiev. It was there that, for the first time, not only in the history of the war, but for the first time in the history of humanity, tens of thousands of people were killed by bullets in a continuous large-scale massacre. It was events like this, on the territory of Ukraine precisely, that made it clear that something like a Holocaust could happen. What does this mean? It means that for every German who takes seriously the idea of responsibility for the Holocaust must also take seriously the history of the German occupation of Ukraine. Or to put it a different way, taking seriously the history of the German occupation of Ukraine is one way to take seriously the history of the Holocaust. Now, how do we evaluate How do we evaluate the question of German responsibility? What about the Ukrainians themselves? Shouldn't Ukrainians themselves be carrying out discussions about what happened in occupied Ukraine during the Second World War? Isn't Ukrainian nationalism also a theme that should be discussed? Of course it is. I made my entire career writing about Ukrainian nationalism. That's why I can be introduced as a professor at Yale University, because I wrote about Ukrainian nationalism, because I wrote about Ukrainian nationalists and the ethnic cleansing of Poles in 1943, because I published the first article in a Western language about the role of the Ukrainian police in the Holocaust and how that led to the ethnic cleansing of Poles in 1943. The Ukrainian nationalism is a real historical tendency, and it ought to be studied judiciously, as some members of the audience here have done better and more recently than I. But if we are speaking not in Kiev, but in Berlin, if we are speaking of German historical responsibility, we have to recognize that Ukrainian nationalism is one consequence of the German war in Eastern Europe. Ukrainian nationalism was a relatively minor force in interwar Poland. It was paid by the German Abwehr, as I'm sure many of you will know. Ukrainian nationalists in Polish prison were released precisely because Germany invaded Poland in 1939. When Germany and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Poland in 1939, destroying the Polish state, this also destroyed all the legal political parties, including the legal Ukrainian parties, which had, up until that point, were much more important than Ukrainian nationalists. So, as I say, if we are in Kiev, then we must discuss the role of Ukrainian nationalists in the Holocaust and in collaboration. When I was in Kiev in September to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Babi Yar, that is the point that precisely I made. But if we are in Germany, it's very important that Ukrainian nationalism be seen as part of German responsibility. It's not something that can block German responsibility. It's not an excuse to avoid German responsibility. Ukrainian nationalism was part of German occupation policy. And when you occupy a country, you have to take responsibility for the tactics and the policies of occupation that you choose. And so Ukrainian nationalism must not be a reason for Germans not to think of their responsibility. It is, in fact, one more reason to think of German responsibility. However, I've probably spoken long enough on that theme. It's very important that when we speak about Ukraine, we're not only speaking about nationalists, yes or no. Nationalists are a relatively small part of Ukrainian history. They're a relatively small part of the Ukrainian present. When we think about the German occupation of Ukraine, we have to remember some very simple, banal points that often escape our attention. Like, for example, there was no particular correlation between nationality and collaboration. Russians collaborated, Crimean Tatars collaborated, Belarusians collaborated. Everyone collaborated. There is no, as far as we can tell, correlation between ethnicity and collaboration, with the partial exception of the Volksdeutsch, of course. But in general, there's no correlation between ethnicity and collaboration. Something else to remember. The majority, probably the vast majority of people who collaborated with the German occupation were not politically motivated. They were collaborating with an occupation that was there and an occupation that is a German historical responsibility. Something that is never said, because it's inconvenient for precisely precisely everyone, is that more Ukrainian communists collaborated with the Germans than did Ukrainian nationalists. This doesn't make sense, and so no one ever says it, but it is precisely the case. Vastly more members of the Communist Party collaborated with the German occupation than did Ukrainian nationalists. And for that matter, very many of the people who collaborated with the German occupation had collaborated with Soviet policies in the 1930s. These points, although they're very basic and they're completely obvious if you think about them, are typical of Ukrainian history. They're typical of the fact that Ukraine was ruled first as part of the Soviet Union, and then under an incredibly bloody and devastating German occupation. When we think about the way that occupation ended, we often overlook certain basic points, like this. Far, far more Ukrainians died fighting against the Wehrmacht than fighting on the side of the Wehrmacht. Incomparably more Ukrainians died fighting against the Wehrmacht than on the side of the Wehrmacht, which is not something that one can say about every country that's considered an ally. It's not something that one can say, for example, about France, which is why there's no official French history of the Second World War, and why there will never be an official French history of the Second World War, even under Macron. There are some things that Macron cannot do, and one of them will be this. He will not write the official history of the Second World War in France, because more French soldiers fought on the Axis side than on the Allied side. Now, more Ukrainians, okay, you didn't think that was as funny as I did, all right. More Ukrainians fought on the Allied side than died on the Allied side than French. More Ukrainians fought and died on the Allied side than British. More Ukrainians fought and died on the Allied side than Americans. More Ukrainians fought and died on the Allied side than French, British, and Americans put together. Why do we not see this, or why do Germans not always see this? Because we forget that Ukrainians were fighting in the Red Army. We confuse the Red Army with a Russian army, which it most definitely was not. The Red Army was the army of the Soviet Union, in which Ukrainians, because of the geography of the war, were substantially overrepresented. So when we think about the way the occupation ended, we also have to remember where Ukrainians were most of the time, that Ukrainians suffered in the German occupation. Again, roughly 3.5 million Ukrainian civilians, mostly children and women, killed. And again, roughly 3 million Ukrainians who die in the uniform of the Red Army fighting against the Wehrmacht. Okay, so where does this leave Germany? And why is this more complicated than it might otherwise seem to be? As a historian, I know the history of Ukraine is unfamiliar, and it can seem complicated. But this is not the only problem. Part of the problem, as I suggested when I mentioned my own country at the beginning, has to do with habits of mind related to colonization, habits of mind related to wars of aggression, habits of mind related to the attempt to enslave another people. The attempt to enslave another people cannot be innocent, even for the generations to come. The attempt to enslave another people, a neighboring people, will leave its mark if not directly confronted. And to make matters worse, we are, of course, not in an environment in Europe today where these discussions can always take place dispassionately. We're at a very precise moment where German attempts to discuss German responsibility are always simultaneously parts of a discussion carried out from elsewhere about responsibility. So when we ask, why are all these basic points not remembered? Why is it not always remembered that Ukraine was the center of Hitler's ideology? Why is it not always remembered that Ukraine was the center of German war planning? Why is it not always remembered that Ukrainians were intended slaves of Germany? Why is it not always remembered that Ukrainians were understood racially by Nazi ideology? Why is it not always remembered that if we want to understand the Holocaust, we have to start with Ukraine? Why is it not always remembered that about 6.5 inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine million die as a result of German occupation? There are lots of reasons, but one of them is the mental temptations left over by colonization, the tendency to overlook a people which was not regarded as a people. All of the language about Ukraine as a failed state, or Ukrainians not as a real nation, or Ukrainians divided by culture in the Deutsche Sprache, that's not innocent. That is not innocent. That is an inheritance of an attempt to colonize a people not regarded as a people. Judgments about Ukraine, where Ukraine is held to other standards, not that it's a beautiful, wonderful place in every respect, it's not, but the application of terms like there not being a Ukrainian nation or there not being a Ukrainian state, if those things are said in German without a direct confrontation with the German attempt to enslave Ukrainians, those words are not innocent. Those words have to be reflected historically in Germany. And there's a particular problem with all of this, which I'm going to mention last and try to mention briefly, which is that the temptation for Germans to avoid oh, sorry, I just noticed that you were all up there. Hi. The temptation for I'm sorry, I haven't looked at you. That's very rude. The temptation for Germans to avoid responsibility, which is always a great temptation, is encouraged by precisely Russian foreign policy. Right? It is Russian foreign policy to divide the history of the Soviet Union into two parts. There's the good part, which is the Russian part, and there's the bad part, which is the Ukrainian part. So, I mean, I can sum this up for you faster than the official memo of the Russian foreign policy does it. Liberation Russian, collaboration Ukrainian, right? That is the line that they follow very consistently, and in this country to great effect, because Russian foreign policy regards the German sense of responsibility as a resource, precisely as a resource, to be manipulated. And the great temptation here is that Germany, which has done so much and which in many ways is so exemplary in its treatment of the past, will fail in this centrally important area of Ukraine, in part because of the temptation that Russia offers. It is so easy to confuse Soviet Union with Rusland. It happens all the time. But it is not innocent, right? Russian diplomats do it, but no German should do it. No German should confuse Soviet Union with Rusland. That simply should not ever happen. The way that Russia handles its memory policy is to export irresponsibility. It's to tempt other countries into the same attitude towards Ukraine that it has itself. And this is particularly evident in this concept of Ukrainian nationalists, which again is not, it's a real historical phenomenon, but it's vastly inflated in the discourse between Russians and Germans. Ukrainian nationalists, Ukrainian nationalism was the reason given, or one of the reasons given, for the Great Famine of 1932 and 1933. Ukrainian nationalism was one of the reasons given for the terror in 1937 and 1938. Ukrainian nationalism was one of the reasons given, this is by Stalin, right, for the massive deportations of inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine after the Second World War. And Ukrainian nationalism was the reason given for the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. There is a common genealogy here and a temptation precisely for Germans. Because if the war was all about nationalism, then why would Germans oppose it? If the Ukrainian government was nationalist, then why should Germany do anything to stop Russia? The danger here is that you enter into a kind of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of the mind, where Germans agree with Russians that the evils that came from Berlin and from Moscow to Ukraine are going to be blamed on Ukrainians. It's so easy. It's so comfortable. It's so tempting to say, haven't we Germans apologized enough? Aren't we the model for everyone else? It's such a tempting trap to fall into. But I can say, and I can say this from experience as an American, if you get the history of colonization and slavery wrong, it can come back. And your history with Ukraine is precisely the history of colonization and slavery. And if the remnants of German nationalism, which are still with you, notice I'm not a diplomat, right? I can say what I want. If the remnants of German nationalism, which are still with you on the left and on the right, meet up with the dominance of Russian nationalism, efficient Russian nationalism, if you find common ground there, if the common ground that you find is, it's all the fault of Ukraine, why should we apologize, why should you remember, this is a danger for Germany as a democracy precisely. Now, it's up to Ukrainians, and this is work that I do much more often, it's up for Ukrainians to try to take responsibility for Ukrainian collaboration or Ukrainian participation in German occupation. It's also up to Ukrainians to figure out the Ukrainian role in Stalin's policies of terror, rather than claiming that those were simply Russian policies, because they weren't. They were Soviet policies in which Ukrainians also played a role. That is historical work for Ukrainians to do. When I was in Ukraine last, in September, talking about Babi Yar, when I was standing not in front of a nice group of well, you're not all Germans. When I was standing in front of millions of Ukrainian television viewers trying to talk about these things in Ukrainian, the point that I tried to make was, you don't remember Babi Yar for the Jews. You remember Babi Yar for yourselves. You remember the Holocaust in Ukraine because it is part of building up a responsible civil society and hopefully in the future a functioning democracy in Ukraine. That holds for them, but it also holds for me and it holds for you. It holds for all of us. The point, and here I think I'm echoing what the ambassador said, the point of remembering German responsibility for the 6.5 million deaths caused by the German war against the Soviet Union, those deaths in Ukraine, is not to help Ukraine. Ukrainians are aware of these crimes. Ukrainians live, the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of that generation, they live with the legacy of these crimes already. The point is not to help Ukraine. The point is to help Germany. Germany as a democracy, particularly at this historical moment, as we face Brexit, as we face election after election with populists, as we face a declining and decreasingly democratic United States of America. Precisely at this moment, Germany cannot afford to get major issues of its history wrong. Precisely at this moment, the German sense of responsibility has to be completed. Perhaps up until now, this was just a matter, Germany getting history right was just a matter for Germans. Perhaps at the time of the Historikerstreit in the 1980s, the history of the Holocaust was only a matter for Germans. It has to be done for Germans, but the consequences are international. Getting the history of Ukraine wrong in 2013 and 2014 had European consequences. Getting the history of Ukraine wrong now, when Germany is the leading democracy in the West, will have international consequences. That's where I leave you. Thank you very much. Дякую дуже.
Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, you have noticed that the composition of the panel up here has changed. I'd like to thank Timothy Snyder for this perfect presentation. My name is Wilfried Jilge. I'm the moderator, and I have a problem because actually all the theses that were presented need to be taken up now, and then we have to build a discussion on all of this. However, we thought that instead of doing this, we'd rather try to do what the intention of history and understanding history is. We'd like to understanding history. How does this impact on our German-Ukrainian relationships? My name is Wilfried Jilge. I am with the German Council on Foreign Relations, where we also do research on Ukraine and the history of Ukraine. I focus on internal and external politics of Ukraine. However, I also worked on this very topic that we talk about tonight. And just recently, within the GDAP, together with the Renaissance Foundation, and I see some familiar faces in this room tonight, we had a Ukrainian-German expert dialogue group which got established. And in this group, we'd like to, well, focus on foreign policy and discuss it with a core group of trusted experts, hold intensive debates, enlarge our knowledge, and then see how foreign policy against the historic background needs to be discussed. Ladies and gentlemen, as a historian with a focus on Eastern Europe, another profession of mine, I'd like to start with a critical remark. And I think I said it earlier on. Such a motion, and we are very grateful to the parliamentary group, Bündnis 90 Die Grüne, and such a debate are always part of politics. And very often it's not really about the truth with view to history. And when it comes to this very complex topic, Ukraine, which usually has a lot of mosaic pieces, we will not find an agreement, especially not who owned the ancient Kiev. But I think it's very important that we have a consensus, a general consensus. And I'd like to remember that this consensus must not necessarily have to do with history. Ukrainians don't really need their history when it comes to their future with Europe. But we know that in 1991, the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainians voted for the independence. And this was in the light of freedom, guided by the European Union. And this is part and parcel. All the rest, of course, can be hotly debated. Of course, we also talk about moral issues. But most important really is that Ukraine already at the time was part of a Europe where is this inalienable right to have a future which can be shaped in a sovereign way, completely independent of which integration model you're part of. And also today, the Ukrainians must be in a position to decide themselves, for themselves, what the security and their own prosperity can look like and can be secured. This is something I wanted to point out. And Timothy Snyder mentioned something else in a very impressive way, because he has not only talked about the crimes committed by the German Wehrmacht, the SS, etc., in Ukraine, but, and fast and foremost, he has not only talked about the relevance of Ukraine for Hitler's war in the East, but since he also talked about the genealogy of the irresponsibility and presented several aspects of this. And therefore, there is something else that brings me back to what I said initially. If the European unification could be part of the answer of what was just presented quite impressively by Timothy Snyder, and if Germany was able to benefit from this, almost from the first hour, also thanks to massive support from the outside, and this support from the outside is not comparable to the support Ukraine gets today, then it must be quite logical that a country which, not only since Maidan in 2014, but since the early 2000 years, committed itself ever more to European values, because there are all these processes which we observed in 2014, led in Ukraine to something that has already a history, but for us still remaining a black box. So, ladies and gentlemen, tonight in our panel discussion, we'd like to try and find out whether this debate on the very complex situations can make a contribution to see Ukraine as an independent state, and also make a contribution to us finding a language together with our Ukrainian partners, so we Germans together with these partners, and to then cope with this legacy, to understand the difficult situation, collaboration, occupied areas, and to see whether, together with the Ukraine and Eastern neighbors, we can talk about white spots without, today, where we have this war of information, become victims of this information policy again of imperial or unimperial groups. And can we also develop enough trust and confidence for Ukraine to make sure that when it comes to Bandera or the legal system reform, we still have enough trust and confidence to make sure that Ukraine knows that we will not water down our expectations, standards, and support. And since we are slightly lagging behind time, I thought I quickly introduce the panel members. To my left, I guess well known to all of you, Marieluise Beck. Thank you so much, Louise, because she is really the main initiator of this event. She is the spokeswoman of Alliance 90 The Greens and the European Parliament, member of different committees, and for many, many years an important voice in the German Eastern European, not only German-Ukrainian, but German Eastern European dialogue. Thank you so much, Marie-Louise, for giving us the opportunity to discuss all this tonight. To my right, I'd like to welcome Katja Petrowskaja, and I guess I don't have to introduce her to you, but I want to do this also. She grew up in 1973, born there and then grew up in Kiev, and then she studied with Yuri Lottmann, the great semiotic expert. She is a journalist, literature expert, and above all, with her book, Maybe Vielleicht Esta, which, by the way, I got the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in 2013. She really enriched European literature as a Ukrainian author. I'm very happy that we have Katja Petrowskaja here. She experienced the imperial situation still. She is a commuter, lives in Ukraine and in Germany, and really has the multinational or bilateral view. And I'm also very happy that I have to my right Jurko Prochasko. In 1970, he was born in Ivano-Frankivsk, but for quite some time he has now been living in Lviv. He is from Eastern Galicia, next to the lady from Kyiv, which is good. So we also have a regional balance that we strike here. He is a German scientist, publisher, and translator, and also an expert in psychology. So if you have a mental problem, you could be treated by him. He's also a very important voice in this dialogue, which in these difficult times also brings us a lot from Ukraine to Germany to really better understand what Timothy Snyder just talked about. Ladies and gentlemen, I thought that we start maybe with Marieluise Beck, then with Katja Petrowskaja, and that you each give a short, and I emphasize a short, input. Then we continue, have a debate in the panel, and then hopefully also have time for you in the audience. So, Ms. Beck. So, why was this initiative born? Well, in our political environment among the Friends of Ukraine, we were always surrounded by the feeling that there is a very limited empathy regarding this movement in Ukraine, the citizens' movement that is, and that there is even less of a conviction that this is a movement of freedom, a freedom movement which we have to support to 100%. And you know what? I was really surprised to see that in the few debates which we had here in the German Bundestag, there was hardly vehement resistance when these voices spoke out, which Timothy just referred to, i.e. that Ukrainians, and Maidan were a main spot for the right forces, Banderas, and the anti-Semitic forces. And this is what we heard in Germany. How can this be that here in Germany, where we supposedly cope to 100% with our own history, we now point fingers, turn to Maidan and say towards the Ukrainians, oh, we cannot really trust and believe in this peace. maybe the collaborators, those who were once collaborators, are planning something in the background again. And therefore, it was quite logical, and here I draw a parallel to Israel, it was quite logical that in this German debate, there is a certain reassurance that took ground. As we can now say with Israel, well, look around what they are doing with the Palestinians. That we now also say, with you to the Ukrainians, look around at what's going on in Maidan. This is the supporters of Banderas. So that we kind of ease and take away our own historical responsibility, if we feel it at all. That was my first point. And second, it seems that there is in Germany a widespread feeling and longing for a great connection and closeness with Russia. Aware of the fact that the political and the economic Soviet Union disappeared and that Russia is not a synonymous for this geographical and economic structure, but rather that there are now many numerous sovereign states, one of them Ukraine. And then on May 8th, when we celebrate the Day of Freedom from Fascism, this must not only be celebrated in Moscow, but that capitals like Kiev, Minsk, Riga must actually be part of this, because Timothy Snyder said this. How great was the suffering of the victims of this so-called, and I also have to say so-called, this huge war for the fatherland. And therefore, this impetus to have this debate here in Germany, talking about the historical responsibility for Ukraine, a very urgent one, so that they can rely on us staying close to them. And we also say that we use the strong political role of Germany to make sure that the other ones also close ranks with you and remain by your side. So this was the driving force for this debate. And now you, Timothy, you confused me a little bit, because you said, well, I mean, you don't really have to have this debate because of Ukraine, but you have to have this for your own sake. You have to have it because of the thinking within your own country. And actually, this is a new aspect to, well, not only say that we are the ones who have to resume responsibility, but to also develop a feeling for us in Germany. We, with our constitution, with our democratic structures, we also depend on us fully understanding our own history. And only if we master doing this will we have a good relationship with today's Russias. Will we be able to push back imperial claims which come from the Kremlin regarding Ukraine? And will then be able to learn that it is unacceptable that the separation of Europe, which was once decided upon Crimea, is to be taken as something normal, something that we have to accept, simply because Europe would end at the ends and borders of the European Union. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I have a hearing problem, so therefore I didn't hear this comment from the audience. And that Ukraine is really part of the cultural family of Europe. Europe is larger of what is comprised by the European Union. So this was three motives for this initiative. And maybe another remark. There was really a reluctance within the German Bundestag to find agreement across all political lines, because I really wished for all of us in the Bundestag to say, and we assume our historical responsibility. Within the past 5 years, in the German Bundestag, we had 2 important debates on the prosecutions of the Armenians, supposedly a very important topic for us. I believe that it's also high time to focus on this part of history of Ukraine, which is even closer to us in terms of geography when it comes to this debate. Thank you so much, Marieluise, for the statement. Thank you so much also for the comment that was shouted out. But maybe you can keep this for later so that we can then get back to you. And maybe we have now first Katja Petrowskaja. And, well, I have a question for you, Katja. During the high times of the Russian-Ukrainian war, at the end of 2014, you said that the war in Ukraine, in the German debate, and by the way, this is a war that was not that far away from us, especially when we compare it with hotspots we have right now. I think about the refugee crisis also taking place on other continents, but that this war didn't really play a real role in Germany, at least not in the long run. If not, there was maybe the Normandy format being filled with life again. And you said that Western Europe seemed to have forgotten the lessons drawn from Second World War. Maybe you can come back to this. Also with you to your following thesis, i.e. that we have a problem here in Germany, which means that we don't have images of this war in Ukraine, because this, of course, also has to do with cultural aspects. And then, with you to what you said in the past, is this still valid today? This was a lot of questions. And I also feel kind of numb after Timothy Snyder's presentation. This was so strong, maybe even overwhelming, so it's really difficult for me to take the floor. It has taken away the whole dimension. And, of course, this also has to do with the modern war. And, of course, we can now talk about the modern war, but how that, if there are only 10,000 dead. So all this is part of the dimension and part of the pictures and images. Actually, the article I wrote at the time is the article that I reread today, and I was quite impressed how strict I was in my language and to what extent I reacted at the time. We still have to do with the war in Ukraine on a daily basis. We can read about this in different portals. People in Beza being brought to Donbass, so military units, that is, and that were further people arrested in Crimea. And it seems that there is really this special situation, the state of emergency, which now turned to a state of normalcy. And of course, this also has to do with our media. The media cannot spread these news all the time, and especially not with all these images. And we know that the war in Ukraine kind of got forgotten by the media when suddenly the refugee crisis emerged. And then we forgot about the images from Ukraine. And now I speak about pictures. There was this one picture of this young boy, which drowned. And thousands of people then reacted and took action because of this picture. And by the way, what was your question? Well, actually, you just answered the question. Because we have the problem that these images, all these pictures, are missing when it comes to this other dimension or this part of the war in Ukraine. And maybe we can go on and say that we do not only miss these pictures of Ukraine and the war, but of Ukraine in general. Yeah, but maybe this has to do with the fact that we have hardly any positive image of Ukraine at all. We know about the Russian soul and the Russian culture, and also what we talked about today. Russia. Russia took the history of the Russian Empire and also of the Soviet Union and, rewrites it. And it's primarily about winning and be the victorious power. And then we don't really know what is the place of Ukraine. And when you describe the history of empires, you also need to understand to what extent everything that we call Russian is really Russian. This worked as something inclusive in the past. And also for me, it was a very interesting moment, around about 3.5 years ago, when I was no longer able to say I'm Russian. Of course, I had a Ukrainian passport, and I said I can speak Russian. But to keep a long story short, I always said that I was Russian, simply for people to understand which languages I speak. And I can no longer do this today. I can no longer do this at all. And I think for a lot of people now, in the times of the crisis, this is a reality. We no longer know which terms and notions we should use, also when it comes to describing ourselves. We don't even know when we started to define ourselves as Ukrainians. And when I say we, then I mean the citizens and the inhabitants from Kiev who were in the past happy to go to Moscow. And see, this is a lot of complicated stories. And if we already talk about Kiev and Russia and all of this, then I have to tell you that the third daughter of Miroslav the Wise was in Hungary, and her name was Anastasia. And there is a sculpture of Anastasia in a monastery at the Balaton Lake. And there is a Ukrainian duchess, which is beautiful. But this is very complicated. And, of course, all this has to do with history. It will take us many more years to separate all this and to define it correctly. Thank you so much, Katja. We'll probably come back to this later, because this also has to do with our topic, the German occupation policy. Germany's occupation policy pushed through something quite radically, i.e. to define people and say, you are a Ukrainian, you are a Jew, and only a Jew. And this, of course, has then the consequences you just described. And a European dimension of the debate means that Europe is also important, because you just touched upon something very important. We are all more than that. Maybe we have in us several internal identities which we must also be able to live. Now I'd like to turn to Jurko Prochasko and a question. You have a slightly provocative thesis, why to spend time with the Ukrainian culture, and you said that cultures from nations which have not achieved the status of the imperial have not yet reached it and will not reach it soon. I mean, of course, in the case of Poland, this is tricky to say, that such cultures from small states, as Andreas Kabala once called it, are kind of protected from collapsing. Can you maybe explain to us what this means against the backdrop of the German-Ukrainian debate, and what must happen to make sure that this doesn't happen? And also tell us what must happen in Germany, in Europe, and the Ukraine for this not to happen. Well, thank you so much. I'm very happy that I can sit next to Katja Petrowskaja. She's my author, so to say. I translated her book into the Ukrainian language, and this is a very nice constellation to now be up here. So thank you so much for this invitation and your introduction. And I asked myself whether it's possible, thinkable, that we might also talk about the Ukrainian responsibility towards Germany. Question mark. Is this possible? Of course it is possible, because we have this mutual obligation. We have obligations and responsibilities for each other as European peoples, as societies and human beings. And to come back to Timothy Snyder's term of universal, we have not only the obligation to understand us as representatives of states and nations, but we also have to see ourselves and our responsibilities as human beings. And therefore, I thought that we also have to talk about the Ukrainian responsibility towards Germany. But then we also need to see whether we can debate it against the backdrop that there is a historical responsibility of Ukraine towards Germany. And then I started to ponder about this, and I thought, probably not. And I will tell you why. I told myself that when we talk about historical responsibility, then we refer to something that was internalized as part of the system of guilt. Guilt emerges when you commit a crime. So we have this triad: crime, guilt, responsibility. Based on this understanding, we cannot really speak of Ukraine's historical responsibility towards Germany because we have not committed any crime against Germany. I mean, of course, we always owe something to each other, and what we owe each other, and this, of course, has to be debated, really must be debated also. However, it's not only about guilt and crimes, but about what we owe each other. And this is, for me, a much nicer part of this responsibility and this mutual responsibility which we must assume. But when we now talk about this historical responsibility, then we almost exclusively and almost automatically refer to crime and crimes and guilt. And in this sense, Ukraine has no historical responsibility. And why is this so? Because we are such good people? Because we don't do any wrong to anyone else? Of course not. Probably we haven't done anything to the Germans, have done no serious crimes, but only because we were not able to. If we had been able to do so, we would. Since we were not able, we also have to see the historical reasons for this. Because we lack the power and we lack the potential. And according to my mind, and this then really brings us right to the heart of the topic, today we actually pretend that European nations, European peoples and societies are all equal and enjoy equal rights, which we do. We enjoy equal rights, but whether we are really equal needs to be discussed. I think there is this inequality, and these inequalities, which we see in different states, also have to do with the fact that we had imperialism right in the heart of Europe. And all across Europe, there was this dividing line between the former hegemonial powers, the large states, the large nations, prosperous nations or empires, and those who were not part of this group. But it's not that easy, because it's not true that there were some countries and states and societies forming the hegemonial group, but the others who were not part of this group were suppressed. Very often suppressed by the empires. And this is why we have this long-lasting problem of internal European post-colonialism. And this is something that we talk about rarely. And only seldomly we really think and talk about it. And therefore we cannot pretend that Ukraine is now in the same situation when it comes to its democratic strength or its state robustness. And when we talk about culture and the erratic element of culture, then this happened as part of a free competition of free societies and cultures which enjoyed all opportunities which were the same. Whether this is bad, I don't know. It's simply reality. However, we should not overlook what I just explained. And this then shows me that there is a different type of historical obligation. And I talk about this obligation of the former European hegemonial powers towards those who were suppressed, exploited, and hindered from becoming what the other ones, the big one, became. And of course, we, the small states, wanted to become a big one. However, we got hindered by you, the big ones. And this, of course, then leads to historical responsibilities which cannot be ignored and simply be pushed aside. So I won't comment on this any further, but I'd like to say that this historical responsibility consists of different layers and has different dimensions. We do not only have to talk about guilt and responsibility. I guess we simply do this tonight first, and because it is the most obvious type of responsibility, and second, because you Germans are well known in the world for committing to guilt. You are really a role model when it comes to the internalization of this behavior. However, this ability to confess to your guilt, whether this then leads automatically to this historical responsibility, is something that needs to be debated. But if we turn away from these immediate crimes, but stick with the historical responsibility, then I say it consists of different elements and dates back to different eras. First, for instance, the era of denazification of Germany, where Germany never ever had been able to make it out of its own strength, but where a lot of other nations, politicians, donors made a contribution to really help Germany to overcome this very devastating National Socialist era and master the transition. And therefore, I also see this historical responsibility where Germany also needs to have a certain understanding, i.e. for those who didn't get so much affection and support. See those countries who didn't benefit from a Marshall Plan. And who need more time. And very often it's also easily forgotten that this approach, where we very often see Germany as the best in class, is not to be taken for granted and didn't happen overnight. No, it grew slowly. Sometimes, however, in view of the processes, and now I talk about the post-Maidan processes in Ukraine, make me feel this impatience, this longing to deliver, to see results, or otherwise we withdraw our trust and confidence and we will take back our support. We already supported you greatly and gave you tremendous help, and if you now don't become the first in class and develop as we did in the past, then we will quickly withdraw our support, and then you can see what you will do by yourself. This is not the right approach. And of course, I'm also trained in psychotherapy. However, I don't want to put all of Germany onto my therapy couch. There are two aspects of this question that goes back to Timothy Snyder, and that was also talked about by Marieluise Beck, but also by the two of you, that the Soviet propaganda created this image, this dichotomy, in fact, this Manichaeic dichotomy. Here, the evil Third Reich with Hitler, and on the other side, the good Soviet Union. I mean, of course, it's understandable. The Putin regime today, the same system being maintained by it for its own goals, is something that we can understand. We must not be surprised that it happens. But the question is why large parts and different parts of German society are still very much willing to support this regime and to copy this regime, this system even. This is difficult to understand. And of course, there are numerous answers to this question. Some can be found in this inequality right in the heart of Europe that we have up until today, and also has to do with the tendency of former hegemonial nations, which are almost like a reflex to always believe the big powers, to count on the big ones instead of focusing on the smaller ones. And maybe this also has to do with the fact that it was more glorious to be on the big battlefields with numerous soldiers than shooting to death Jews in the bushes. And maybe this also has to do with the fact that large part of the German population after the war got help from there, and that the Soviet, the Stalinist, this whole model as the only credible alternative to National Socialism and German fascism seemed to be robust, which of course led also to guilt on their shoulders. But maybe it also has to do with quite current reasons. Ukraine. When we hear these terms as Germans, Ukraine, then we are most of the time concerned. We don't want to have it here. We want to have it outside. We don't want to accept it and embrace it. And this is not because we don't know what we get with these highly suspicious collaborators. But there is another reason. When we talk about National Socialism here in Germany, and when someone is said to be National Socialist, then we think of a German Nazi. What we always do to each other is having projections. Tonight, there was already a lot of talk about Ukrainian nationalism. And of course, you don't have to like it. You don't have to justify it. But you have to come to terms with it. And this must be done by ourselves. Ukrainian nationalism, however, was an emancipatory one, not a hegemonial one. However, this doesn't make it a nicer one. And this does not mean that the Ukrainian nationalists committed less crimes, only because they are representatives and supporters of an emancipatory Ukrainian nationalism. This does not mean that they weren't involved in killing Jews. It does not mean that they had not collaborated. But, and this is what I'd also like to say here in the presence of Katja, whose relatives lie in Babi Yar. In Babi Yar, we have Ukrainian nationalists shot to death by Germans. Would you say that these people are now nicer ones? Is this a conclusion we draw automatically? Maybe, maybe not. I just want to say that the Ukrainian nationalisms are not automatically Nazis. I think we have to stop to see Ukrainian nationalists as German Nazis and collaborators. And for me, it's not even that parts of Ukrainian nationalism also stood up against the Wehrmacht and the Hitler regime and died in this cause, got killed for this by the Nazis, and also now lie in Bamiyan. But it's very important to me that we finally, and of course I know that this is impossible, that we should finally stop to project images on prejudice, which we also like, on each other, and that we rather try to differentiate more. To then, and this is really a mutual responsibility we all have, that if we finally take the European project seriously, even though it is not sexy and it's definitely not erotic and it's not always fun. To the contrary, very often it is also very annoying and time-consuming and requires a great effort, that we do have an interest for each other. And this is what we owe each other, and this is our obligation.
Ganz vielen Dank, Jurko Prochasko.
Thank you. I mean, that was much more than 7 minutes. But you were allowed to speak longer because you talked about the German standard of memory, and you also spoke about the double ideas. I mean, what does it mean, a Ukrainian nationalist? What about a Ukrainian wearing a Bandera shirt, or a Ukrainian Jew wearing such a shirt in order to tell the people, I don't want to be freed by Bandera but by Putin? So when someone speaks about Bandera, we don't know what he has heard. But I would like to come back to the comments. Timothy Snyder, could you maybe comment on what has been said here?
Ich würde dann sehr kurz sprechen.
I will be brief because I think we have talked quite a lot and the audience should also get a chance to take the floor. It's an honor for me to be here with Katja Petrowskaja and Jurko Prochasko. I think we should not only talk about obligation, we should also talk about needs or the wish to do something, since Jurko has mentioned obligations. It's important to also listen. I maybe cannot answer the question whether Ukraine is on the European or the American side, but in Germany, we did not. Sorry, in the United States, we haven't listened to Ukraine in the last 2 or 3 years, and neither did Germany. We have projections, but the future can be interesting and can be important. What we are experiencing in the United States today, we would not have to experience had others listened. We didn't listen, so we paid a price. That's all I want to say. I think we've heard quite a lot, so I would like to suggest that we give the audience a chance to take the floor. And actually, I cannot guarantee that we will be capable of answering all questions. There will be one round of questions because we are running over time already now. So please, your questions, and please be brief, or a comment is allowed too, but please be brief and introduce yourselves. And please let us also know who you are addressing, and switch the mic on.
Nee. Also wir hören hier, da kommt jetzt die Technik. Ja.
Hallo?
Ja, wunderbar.
Ja, gut.
Bitte schön, Ihre
Okay.
Frage.
Ja, er sagte,
Concerning Ukrainian nationalism, Jurko said it's an emancipatory nationalism and we should understand. But when in February 2014 there was an international agreement made and Germany participated, and this was made with the opposition and the Yanukovych government, and one day later people invaded government buildings and the most important parties started to persecute people in the streets and even killed them. In view of this, we should discuss what could have happened in Germany or other European states, or when in May 2014 in Odessa, in the trade unionists HQ, 200 persons, women, children, old people, were killed by right-wing extremists. What would have happened had this happened in a West European city? And the survivors of the massacres are still in Ukrainian prisons today. I have brought Oleg Musaka. He is a survivor. His brother was almost killed. I mean, these are assassins. These are murderers. What would have happened had it happened in West Europe? And I mean, some of these assassins are members of parliament in the city council of Odessa, for example. So do we have to be indulgent? Do we have to understand those killers? Well, I'd like to suggest that we collect a number of questions before we have the round of answers. Now, this question was for Jurko Prochasko, first of all, but the others can all answer too. Mr. Prochasko said, well, introduce yourself, please. Diana Siebert, a historian and member of the Green Party. Mr. Prochaska said that crime and guilt lead us to the idea of responsibility. However, I think there is responsibility also without crime and guilt in Ukraine and in Germany, because the first peace treaty made between the German Reich and Ukraine meant the recognition of Ukrainian statelhood, so we could also connect to this. Ralph Fuchs, please. I have a question to the two historians in the round. Mr. Jilge, Mr. Snyder, could you tell us a bit more about the importance of the past for the present? I mean, what does history mean for politics today? Mr. Jilge, when you opened this round, you said we can easily talk about history, talk on and on. We may even discuss it or quarrel. But you see Ukraine moving into the direction of an independent nation and maybe democracy. So the question is, what do we have to deal with when dealing with history? My thesis is referring to the German perception or the German mood or the lack of empathy for Ukraine, which cannot be explained unless we deal with history. My question is for Professor Snyder.
I wanted to ask about your point, thesis, that Ukrainian nationalism is a large part or to a large extent fostered by or a byproduct of the German Abwehr and sort of like fascist thinking. So then my question is, to what extent then is the Volhynia massacre by the UPA of Polish citizens, can that be interpreted as somewhat a German responsibility as well? And then the next part would be, how could Germany play a role in the historical debate between Poland and Ukraine that has so recently poisoned Polish-Ukrainian politics?
Thank you very much. I think that is a question to Mr. Snyder, but also maybe to Marieluise Beck. Yes? Okay.
Yeah, Anna.
Very good.
Yeah.
The last question is the first round. Yevhen Bistritsky was the next. Thank you.
Yevhen Bistritsky. I am philosopher and the executive director of the Soros Renaissance Foundation in Ukraine. I would like to continue this topic of the responsibility. Of course, there is responsibility not because we were guilty, but because we have not reached, we have not implemented high values. I would like to ask you, maybe the all panelists. In Ukraine, we are experiencing responsibility for European values. We feel ourselves as we are on frontiers. In fact, we are championing, we defend some maybe ideal values, European values, values of freedom, independency, human rights from conservative, authoritative, totalitarian Russia. So, because we feel responsibility for values, and we would like to just deliver this feeling to you. And because of that, Mr. Snyder, Professor Snyder, mentioned the responsibility of Germany for democratic values in Europe. We feel responsibility, positive responsibility for European values as well. Because of that, perhaps Germany and other European countries could understand us and could support us in this feeling of responsibility for high values. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ich will noch einen dazu nehmen, weil Sie haben sich ganz lange...
There is one more speaker who wants to take the floor. Andreas Schönfelder is my name. I'm from Groß-Heinersdorf, a borough in Berlin. In addition to what Jurko said, and I will ask him whether he agrees to my additional remark, complementing his statement. Now, if I may count myself as part of the West, I'd like to say that people talked about the shame of Yalta in 1989, and even people who didn't know what it was about looked ashamed. And then the Eastern expansion started, and then people began to see what the East was like. And then people started adopting their traditional way of seeing the East. as an underdeveloped region. And I wonder, why don't we talk about this East German paradigm shift? I mean, if you don't consider the civilizational special path of the West, you don't understand what's going on. 300 years of wealth created, however, at the expense of resources used by many people. This is what we are celebrating. We are praising ourselves, and we consider all others underdeveloped, but with the exception of the Nazi time or communism, we need to see that there is a lot of destruction in this approach. And yet we praise ourselves. And that's actually a debate I would like to have here too, so that we understand what our weaknesses are. We should be much more modest. Thank you for this impulse. I would like to interrupt now in order to listen to the answers. The first question was about 22nd, 22nd February 2014, Maidan, and the agreement made with the so-called Weimar Circle, which was a question for you, Jurko. But the second question was also for you. This was about the truth and historical events. The 2nd May and the trade union HQ in Odessa were what this question was about. But of course, everybody else can contribute. But Jurko first. I will answer both questions. The first one and the last one. Concerning the first question, you overheard something. I spoke about difference, the difference between European nationalisms. However, you insinuate that I asked for understanding, or I wanted to adopt a mild attitude. That's not what I want to do. I don't want to say that an emancipatory nationalism in its ugly and very violent excesses is nicer, or is something we could easier sympathize with. This is not my point. I wanted to say we should stop projecting our inner images and contents on others. That's what I wanted to say with respect to emancipatory nationalism. And actually, there's never a clear picture. In the end, it can be beautiful and have wonderful sides, but it can also be ugly and criminal. Now, concerning the events you mentioned, I would have loved to get an answer to the question. I would have loved to see what happened after the negotiations in Kiev. And of course, I want to know what happened in Odessa. I'm very interested in learning more about it, and I want it investigated. That's another interest we should share. We need an honest and a truthful investigation of the events, no matter what the result. Of course, this cannot be done immediately. It doesn't happen overnight. As the example of Malaysia Airline H17 shows. We could also go and say it's apparent, it's obvious, there is no doubt whatsoever who shot the aircraft so that it crashed. However, it has taken months and years until they produced results in the investigations. Andreas Schoenfelder, your question, let me answer it as follows. It might be interesting to take Ukraine out of the other context and to be quite clear about what we want to do and how we want to see Ukraine. We don't want to see it as one element of the big Central and Eastern European set. Now, such a procedure might make sense. To just go and say, we look at Ukraine, first of all. But of course, we nevertheless have to see the broader context, because without the context, we don't understand a thing. Thank you. Anybody else? Mrs. Beck. I'm looking at Masha. We went to Odessa right after the events. We talked to lots of people. There was a camp in the city with pro-Russian activists. They had camped in the city for a long time without any problem. And then there were demonstrations and protest marches in the city. And then it became clear that two trains would clash. Pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian supporters. The police did not intervene. They just watched. A shot was fired. A young Ukrainian man died. His wife was pregnant. A tragedy. And then people said, okay, let's go to the trade union headquarters. And then the group went there, and until today, we don't know what happened. And sorry, I listened to you, so it's my turn now. It wasn't women and children who worked in the trade union HQ. It was militants and active members of the groups and trade unions who were there. It was very difficult to find out who did what, and of course we recommended to invite international observers. And actually I wonder, do you want to listen or not? We recommended that international observers be invited to Odessa in order to find out what happened, because otherwise this event would always be a problem in the city and a barrier against the process of growing together. And Odessa is a difficult city still today. You also have mafia structures or mafia-like structures who benefited from the situation of the city, and they are still part of the political sphere of the city. And that's all I want to say about Odessa. A second remark. We've been traveling with musicians from the city of Brim, from Odessa, that is. And we also organized citizens' trips to Odessa, and we experienced what Jurko described, i.e. the lack of knowledge and the cultural hubris, and the fact that people are surprised to realize that you have great artists, great musicians in Odessa, that Slav Richter is from Odessa, that Oistrakh was taught in Odessa, and this is a key aspect, i.e. the European glance, or the West European glance, or Germany towards Ukraine, and the fact that people have difficulties in understanding that there is a Ukrainian high culture, and that Odessa, for example, is a European city, and the country is a European country. There is a danger in it, I'd say. That's Germany and Russia, are former hegemonic powers, no matter in which form, within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire or whatever. But we are still meeting on the same level, i.e. we share a feeling, i.e. we could get along, we could solve the problems, which means that politicians travel from Berlin to Moscow in order to negotiate about Ukraine, and they just fly over Ukraine. And that's what you do if you lack the feeling that there is a trap, and that's the trap of hegemonic categories. Ukraine, and that's what you feel time and again, is also a disturbing factor in the good understanding between Berlin and Moscow, or along this particular axis. And here again, our responsibility needs to be mentioned, because that's a scandal. We insist on the European values, the rule of law, democracy, freedom, and human rights. We claim these are European values. But there, where people fight for these rights, we prefer to fly over right into the country which has an autocratic government, and where authoritarian thinking is very popular. And that's a danger for our societies, which are meant to be and to remain open ones if we truly cherish Europe. Thank you. I think we have to postpone the question about 21st, 22nd February. But I would like to say that you need to be careful with what you say. If you claim people were killed, you have to go with names. I'm talking about 21st February. And actually, I'd like to ask you to listen. I'm not talking about Odessa. You should not simply go and mix things up. I'm talking about what Putin calls a coup, and which was triggered or started by the Tehippo group within the party in the region, because Yanukovych had lost power and confidence before, not only in Kiev, but in Ukraine as a whole. And look at the parliamentary debate of Saturday, 22nd February. You won't see fearful MPs representing the regions. And I'd just like to ask you to also take this particular aspect on board. It's important what Jurko Prochasko said. We should not discuss about too many narratives with respect to the events in Ukraine. We need the facts. Well, there is one more question, and we need to be focused and efficient and quick. Mrs. Siebert asked a question, and I would like to ask Timothy Snyder to answer. I mean, doesn't the German responsibility not start at an earlier stage? The contract of Brest-Litovsk was made before the Versailles Treaty. Maybe you can briefly comment on this question, and then Mr. Fuchs's question will be answered.
If you don't mind, I'm going to try to answer all the questions at the same time, and I'm going to try to answer them in a way that's faster than they were asked. The question of the UPA in 1943 is going to be obscure to many people. The UPA was a Ukrainian paramilitary organization largely formed from Soviet partisans, organized by Ukrainian nationalists who had been trained by the German police. So it is par excellence an example of the multinational, or if you prefer, colonial character of Ukrainian history in the 20th century. And it's a very good example, this incident of Ukrainian nationalists killing Polish civilians, it's a very good example of the dance or the dialogue between history and memory. So if your question is a historical one, a causal one, is Germany partly responsible? The answer is, of course, yes. There's no way that Ukrainian nationalists could have been killing Poles in the tens of thousands without the German invasion. Likewise, it's also Soviet responsibility. There's no way that Ukrainian nationalists would have been killing Poles in the tens of thousands in 1943 without the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in 1939. This is a long story. I wrote an entire book about it. So causally, there's no way to understand it without the Germans and the Soviets. But morally, it's also for Ukrainians to consider, because it's always the case that there's some larger outside force. There's always a larger outside force. But that doesn't mean that in your own national discussions, you can excuse yourselves. It has to be considered by every nation. And that brings me to the issue of why history is interesting, or why history is important. Because whether you're Ukraine, or whether you're Germany, or whether you're America, or whether you're Russia, we will always be tempted by memory. We'll always be tempted by the first person. We'll always be tempted by subjectivity. We'll always be tempted to leave out the perspectives of others. And to have history, a proper history, you have to have the languages, the perspectives, the experiences of others beside yourself, as many as possible. So history is practice for being European. History is practice for having European cities. History is practice for the European Union itself, because in order to have European integration, you have to have the reflex of trying to look at things from the other side's point of view as an equal. Which leads me to the question about world history and colonialism, which I actually find extremely interesting. One reason to study Ukrainian history, and this is something that Jurko Prochasko hinted at, is that Ukraine is actually the key to understanding the link between European history and world history, because it is in Ukraine precisely where the main current of European history, that is to say, colonialism, imperialism, returns to Europe. And so when we're studying Germany in 1941, among other things, we're studying the last gasp of European colonialism. And when we're studying the European Union, the European Integrations Project, the European Integration Project is not about how you all learned from the Second World War that war is a bad thing. That is completely false. You didn't all learn that. I mean, trust me, you didn't learn that. What Europeans learned from was colonial wars that you lost. The first one was the German War in the East. After that followed French and Dutch and British defeats. And the substitute for the hierarchical relationship that was imperialism is the rule of law egalitarian relationship that is the European Union. And what makes the European Union so precious is that it creates the space that empires once created, this precisely the kind of space that Hitler aspired to, without the conquest and without the inbuilt racial and other hierarchies. But the price of all of that is that you have to have history. The price of all of that is understanding each other's historical point of views. And as I started, I mean, one of the problems, even for the wisest of us, and even for the most powerful of us, is that our political structures can turn out to be surprisingly fragile if we overlook important historical points. And I'm convinced that for Germans, just as for Americans, getting slavery wrong is coming back to haunt us. For Germans, getting Ukraine wrong can come back and haunt you. It's a major example of a general issue, which is that you can't have Europe without reciprocity. You can't have Europe without the habit of listening to the other side, and history is practice for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Ich möchte nur eine kurze Anmerkung machen, Frau Siebert.
Ms. Siebert, one short remark, and I will now quickly take over. What you said, whether German responsibility starts with Priest of Brest-Litovsk in the First World War, well, then you're actually right, because the occupation policy of the Mediterranean states in the First World War was completely different to the Second World War. So the middle-sized states tried to say that there was this approach, also the Ukraine as a state. However, the fatal is that in 1939 and 41, Ukraine thought that if now the German comes after the era of Stalin, then it will be a bit like in 1980. And this was the fatal error. And if we now continue with this paradigm, we are also responsible for this. So this as a side remark. And then the third question. Mr. Fuchs, and I think this is for Mr. Snyder and myself, I tried to streamline this at the very beginning to make sure that some basic principles we need for debate are not overlooked. However, for me, policy of history is nothing negative. For me, it's very important that what we do today can be put into perspective. And I fully agree with you. It's very important to know what type of relations we have. A project like Ukraine, why does it matter for us? And I guess at the end of the day, we also need empathy. And I believe, and allow me to give you an example, it's possible that when we think about our history, take a certain distance from the past to then internalize it once again. See, this intermediate Europe, this is something that everybody now talks about again, the zone of influences in the DGAP. We recently had this debate where a peace researcher said, oh, this is really bitter what's happening in Ukraine. And he doesn't really appreciate Putin and the annexion neither. But maybe, he says, we need to recognize that this is a reality. Russia wants this zone of influence, and it's bitter, but we need to accept it. And from a historic perspective, I would now say, and of course this historian said that Ukraine must remain sovereign but cannot take a decision. They don't have a choice. And then I would say, free of any history politics, and maybe Mr. Snyder agrees, influencing zones from the time between the wars caused all the trouble. For me, it was interesting that a German peace forscher from the time between the two wars, who did research on the Second World War, has not learned anything, because Stalin was the culmination of all the zones of influence. And we need all this to understand why we do what we do right now. And then there's also a rational self-assurance. There are factual arguments, which is that we make sure that this never, ever happens again.
If I could just add a theoretical dimension to this point, with which I completely agree. If you, as a German, say there's such a thing as Zwischen Europa, or there's such a thing as a zone of influence, you have to think not just about what you're doing to Ukraine. You have to think about what you're doing to yourself. Because it's in Europe's imperial history that zones of influence could function. And so the moment when you say, we have the power, or you imply, we, Germany, have the power to decide that such and such a state is not a normal state, but rather a state that falls into a gray zone. At that moment, you are declaring yourself to be imperial. Think of the first sentence of Carl Schmitt's Politische Theologie. Wer souverän ist der einen Ausnahmezustand machen kann. So was. Elegante, weil er gut schrieb. But the idea is, if you are the one who can say that this is an exceptional state, that means that you've accepted Schmitt's idea of what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is no longer something, according to the European Union, which is equal and shared and reciprocal. Sovereignty is a matter of who has the power to say that someone else is sovereign. So if you Germans say, Ukraine is in a gray zone, Ukraine is in a zone of influence, there's a zwischen Europa, what you are doing is saying, we, Germany, are not a European state. We are authoritarian. We are imperial. We disagree with the Europe that we have helped make. And that's bad enough. But you're also encouraging Russia to do the same. It's not in Russia's interest for there to be a zwischen Europa. It's not in the interest of the Russian Federation for Russia to be an authoritarian empire. If you, Germany, say Ukraine is in a Russian zone of influence, you are using German power, moral power, that precious resource, German moral power, to help Russia become an authoritarian empire. So anyway, I think I've made my point. I'll stop.
Thank you very much. I adopted the term Zwischeneuropa because there was a very interesting book in 1929 about Zwischeneuropa und die deutsche Zukunft von Giselher Wirsing, ein antidemokratischer Vordenker, der heute wieder bei der AfD frönt.
An antidemocratic pioneer. Ms. Beck, you also have the floor. Yeah. One more observation I'd like to share with you. And I made this observation primarily last year. This great unease, if at all the Hitler-Stalin Pact is mentioned, by the way, because the Hitler-Stalin Pact is, well, like a big no-no. And I really spent a lot of time thinking, understanding why this seems to be so inappropriate. And actually, this must be the case. I mean, as you just flashed out, because this hegemonial thinking is, at the end of the day, a trap for us. I mean, you said that this led to all the problems. And I don't really have a robust explanation for all this. Sometimes, however, I think that the fact that the German guilt and our historical responsibility is so huge that for a long time it was thought that every single consideration of other crimes and responsibility linked to it could lead to diminish our responsibility, and therefore we didn't do it in the first place. But I'm firmly convinced that because of the future of Europe and also because of Ukraine, which is so crucial, we need to dare to approach and talk about the Hitler-Stalin Pact.
So with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and this question of responsibility, it's very interesting to read the justification that the Russian highest court gave for confirming the conviction of a Russian citizen who forwarded a Facebook post which mentioned the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So according to Russian law, it is illegal for a Russian citizen to describe Russian history in a way which a Russian court will find inappropriate, basically. So a Russian citizen posted an article which mentioned the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He was convicted of a crime, And this crime was confirmed, his guilt was confirmed by the Russian High Court. And the logic given is the interesting part. The logic given is that this was not a German crime, right? So the German High Court says that its standard is the international standard of Nuremberg. And since Soviet crimes or Soviet aggression was not tried at Nuremberg, it is therefore not a crime, right? In other words, we've reached the absurd position where Russian law says literally all the responsibility has to be on the German side. It is illegal to suggest that somebody besides Germany participated at the beginning of the Second World War, right? I mean, so not only is Russia not taking responsibility for being the German ally that began the Second World War, and of course any discussion of collaboration with Germany has to begin with the question, who was the German ally that helped Germany begin the Second World War? And the answer is the Soviet Union. Not only is that not discussed, it's illegal to mention it on the grounds that only German crimes are crimes. That should give Germans something to think about.
Thank you so much. Wir müssen jetzt Schluss.
Actually, we now have to come to a close, but I have one more question of Mr. Bystrzycki, and I think we can then comment on this quite briefly, because Mr. Bystrzycki said or asked, we in Ukraine, we made the experience on a daily basis that we need to defend European values. And whether it's not now up to Europe or to us to do this again, and whether maybe something could spill over from Ukraine to us. And I think this is maybe a good opportunity to conclude the round. And I thought that maybe I start with Katja Petrowskaja, maybe just very briefly before we come to a close. I see a gentleman up there, and I'm not really sure whether we should listen to this. I'm not the moderator, but well. There is a guy that we cannot ignore up there. Okay, but then this means that we cannot discuss this last... Mr. Musica?
Ми возьмем тогда ваш вопрос как последний и прошу...
Okay, then your question will be the last question. Please, your question. Well, maybe you can briefly introduce yourself. Yes, I'm Oleg Musica. I am from Ukraine. I come from Odessa. And I was with the events on May 2nd. Short question, Mr. Musica. We don't have time left. So, my first question. The first question is for Timothy Snyder. And this is my question. There are American politicians, McCain, John Biden, etc. What have they done in Kiev on Maidan in 2013 when the democratically elected president was ousted? And the second one is not a question but a comment to my fellow citizens from my home country. No one forbids Ukraine to celebrate 9th of May, the day of victory. The Ukrainian government makes everything possible to allow people not to celebrate this day. They rebaptize streets in Odessa, the city of heroes. Streets now have names of banderas, etc. And this conversation, this discussion would not take place if in 2014 we had a referendum a referendum on the federal character of Ukraine. Until the new election of the new president, we only had half a year. He had only the support of round about 5% of the population. We could have ousted him in a normal way. And then today we had no longer to be here and talk about Crimea and Odessa. And Ms. Beck, I'd like to show you something. After the discussion, I'd like to show you a video which shows that also women and children and old people were in this building. But this is impossible, and therefore now wait for questions. Excuse me, I would now kindly ask you, because we're not in an election campaign for the return of Mr. Yanukovych. No. And I'd like to thank you because, of course, your aspects are very important, and this is why I gave you the floor, and this is why now I answered very shortly the question of Mr. Brzezinski and gave you the opportunity to say something, and now we have one more opportunity to answer. Who would like to do this? Or should we just leave it like this? Mr. Snyder. So Mr. Snyder probably has a good comment to make.
Дуже коротко, бо мені здається, що всі вже були.
So there were politicians on Maidan, and they were all present, and Pani Moland was there. However, we were not there. We were not there where actually our presence was needed. And I am of the opinion what the Russian artillery did in Donbass. This is even more important questions. And the battalion, Vostok. What did they do in the Donetsk basin? And the Russian soldiers on Crimea? Why does Glasnov go to Odessa? Making phone calls. We know all the answers, of course, to all these questions, not yet, but they are very important. Very important for me, however, is, with view to all these questions, also the issue of responsibility. Because we don't know yet what was happening on our side. We had to see that something very important was going on in Ukraine. However, we failed to do so. Ukraine was alone, isolated on Maidan. They had rights, but we weren't there. I have a suggestion. The reason, or rather the thought, that the Americans sparked Maidan is not true. The Ukrainians were on Maidan because they saw this necessity from a political perspective. So it was not the Americans who wanted this. The Americans didn't want that, no. They were against it. They were highly conservative at the time. And when we now write about the history of Maidan, or whenever we want to discuss the events, then we have to think about Ukrainians and not blame the Americans. Well, unfortunately, everybody, we now have to come to a close. We have seen tonight, and I think this is really the best result of this event, especially in the past 15 minutes or 20 minutes, we have seen what falls into this basket: Ukraine, Germany, Europe. And I'd like to thank you so much for all the contributions. I mean, this is only a beginning. This debate needs to be continued. simply because it is in our mutual interest and because it's wonderful. It's so wonderful that together we can have debates with Ukraine in Europe and that we have a new excellent neighbor. And this is why we now like to conclude, and please enjoy the rest of the evening. No, I have to say something else. I was so enthusiastic, and of course this has to do with time pressure, but I'd like to ask Mr. Sarrazin to make a few final comments. Well, the challenge of this evening, to sum it up, is huge. I mean, usually there's 10 minutes for the summaries, also to have a certain buffer. But I'd like to share a few thoughts. I'm part of the generation of Germans who, when it comes to historical policy, keep a certain distance, and who only recognized, once we became politicians, to what extent history is going on. See, when we discussed whether we should save Greece or not, it also brought us to Weimar, and also when it comes to the question to what extent Germany is a successful example of successful history policy is important. I think it's important to turn to our eyes to Central Europe, what I call it, and see that history policy is of tremendous power. In talking about history, Ukraine, Russia, and the whole complex of topics we have discussed tonight, I always feel a certain concern, i.e. that the propaganda forces of the Kremlin are able to take pieces of history, use it with its own strength, and that our counter-constructions are not strong enough. Rather, we have to be willing to lead debates, to then deconstruct, understand, take different perspectives, to be more or less superior to the construction of the legitimization of certain political actions. And this is why I believe the debate tonight was a very important one. However, I also think that the initial thesis of Mr. Snyder also needs to be debated in detail, because one thing is very important. It's very important, of course, to teach the Germans that colonial nationalist genocide of General East and the war theory in the East primarily focused on the eastern areas, which are today Ukraine, but also took place in other areas where we had Ukrainian people, that this is important for our understanding of today's history. However, we also have to see that the Nazis at the time didn't picture today's Ukraine with its current structure and didn't really have a clear understanding of Ukraine-Belarus, but that it was a bigger project. And therefore, I think that we should not replace this debate by a debate where we focus only on Ukraine, but that we really have a highly inclusive debate where we try to find a joint perspective on this joint history. Because otherwise there is the risk that we decouple and detach parts of the debate. And we talked about the Polish-Ukrainian problems of the history. Of course, we also need to understand how we have to interpret the Lithuanian-Ukrainian history, the Austrian-Ukrainian history, and whether the Jew killed in Galicia was a Jew or Austrian or Ukrainian or what, or didn't he care when he got shot to death. I think what we can learn tonight is that when we master to have these debates in a way that the thesis and maybe also controversial debates allow us to get a better understanding when it comes to closeness between different elements. And of course, this also brings us to Yalta and the ban to talk about the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And that we then also enjoy the lucky stroke for the Western Germans that we can talk about it because some weren't allowed to do so, shows us that we have not yet understood that since 1989 there was a huge transformation taking place on our continent, which has not yet come to a close if we really want to complete this project. And I think this jointness and common aspect is important. And I think when we now have a final round of applause, we have to thank once again, Marieluise Bundestag, because in the Bundestag, she is the one who really pushed forward these debates in the Bundestag. And she really made a huge effort. Many of us probably had not tolerated all this. You went to Maidan, you saw death, and also when it comes to the debate she had to have here, she really suffered a lot and endured a lot. And this is why I'd like to thank you very much personally, Marieluise. And I think this final round of applause is, of course, for all the panelists, but also for Marieluise and her hard work in the past few years.